Hello, my name is Jakob Müller,
Hi, my name is Naya.
and in today's episode of Wannsee, we will speak about France during the Holocaust. And this is the reason why I'm joined by Naya. She is from France and our current volunteer from Action Reconciliation Service for Peace. Is this right?
That's true.
Okay, that's the right name. We are very happy to have you, Naya. Our guest on the podcast today is Renée Poznanski. She is a professor emerita in the Department of Politics and Government at Ben Gurion University in Israel and has been a fellow at numerous institutions, amongst which the Sciences Po in Paris, Harvard University, and the United States Holocaust Museum. Her research focuses on the Jews in France during the Second World War, a topic to which she devoted several books and numerous articles. Her book, Propaganda and Persecution, The French Resistance and the So-Called Jewish Question, won the prestigious Henri Hertz Prize and has just been translated to English. We are very happy to have you, Renée.
Thank you, Jakob.
We want to start with a short introduction into the historical context before the occupation. France won the First World War, 1914 to 1918, against Germany. And indeed, France had occupied large parts of Western Germany after the First World War. It had regained Alsace-Lorraine and was the proponent of a strict enforcement of the Versailles Treaty.
So when the Nazis came to power in Germany, France was the most important place of asylum for refugees coming from Germany, but also Eastern Europe, like Poland or Romania. France was a refuge for Jews, but also all kinds of political opponents of the Nazi regime.
Amongst the 300,000 Jews living in France at the beginning of the war, only about 90,000 had French nationality, as far as we know, because there was no official statistics on the number of Jews in France. The French Republic had a strict separation of religion and state.
Especially since 1905. And in 1937, Léon Blum, a socialist politician and a Jew, was elected head of the government. And in 1939, a law against racism and anti-Semitism in the press was accepted by the French parliament.
So when we take this into account, you could say that maybe there was anti-Semitism in France, but at the same time there was an awareness of the threat that anti-Semitism posed. There was a political response to anti-Semitism. Would you agree with this description of France before the war?
Actually, I would have to go back to some of the things you said. I mean, France was indeed a place of refuge. It was the most important place of refuge in Europe at the eve of the war. The many foreigners had come to France, and not only Jews. In the 20s, it was an economic reasons which pushed them to come to France, and they were encouraged by the French state because after World War I, there was a lack of manpower. But in the 30s, after the financial crisis of the beginning of the 30s, it was most of the refugees came for political reasons. And you know what? You just have to look at a map of Europe at that time, and you see how France was at the center of all the. I mean, that was the only place where refugees from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Italy, Spain, and all these countries could come to find refuge. And actually, France was the most open country. It was true for all these political opponents in the different countries. It was true for the Jews as well. But, and that's the other side of the same coin, during the 30s, a lot of tension began to develop in Europe against Jews, against foreigners. The conception, the vision of what a nation is, what it is constituted of, became extremely nationalistic and ethnically defined. And for that reason, in France as well, there was a wave of xenophobic feelings and of anti-Semitism.
May I jump in here? If you speak of the 1930s, so you said that in the 1920s, many refugees or immigrants from Eastern Europe were encouraged for economic reasons. But in the 1930s, it were mainly political refugees.
Absolutely.
And what did change when the Nazis came to power? Did the atmosphere towards Jews change in France?
Yes, actually, it began to change immediately. I mean, because Jews began to come into France, but they were coming before as well from Eastern Europe. And they were a minority among all those political opponents coming to France. I mean, if you look at the numbers, foreign Jews constituted no more than 0.4% of the population. All the Jews together, no more than 0.7% of all the population. And yet, they became the symbol of this invasion of subversive elements coming into France. But that's not the most important, because we are talking now about the fierce anti-Semites. Yet there was something much more dangerous, in my opinion, is the fact that a consensus has begun to be the main trend in French opinion, that there was a Jewish question in France. Mm-hmm. France had to resolve this Jewish question. France has been invaded by the Jews. They were dominating in politics. Look, Léon Blum became head of the government, forgetting, by the way, that he has been elected. There was a cultural domination of the Jews. There were an economic domination of the Jews. Look what's going on among the physicians, among the jurists, and it became a kind of accepted discourse that people thought that maybe you should restrain the rights of the Jews. Others said, well, no, the Jews themselves might have to restrain themselves. But it had become a kind of a legitimate question of maybe there should be laws taken to restrain the power of the Jews. And in my view, that was most important, because those people were always beginning by saying, I'm not anti-Semitic. What Hitler does in Germany it's not acceptable. That's barbarity. Of course, nobody in France wants such a thing. But we have a Jewish question, and it's an objective question. It's an objective fact, and we have to deal with it. And this was, common knowledge. A common conception, and it was very much popularized by French intellectuals, French writers. The intellectual elite of France pushed this kind of idea.
Mm-hmm. So that, to sum that up, that there is not a problem of anti-Semitism, but there is a Jewish problem, that there is not a question of anti-Semites attacking the values of the Republic, but there is a Jewish question. So this is basically what you're saying.
Both were there, because those people who claimed they were not anti-Semites and wanted just to solve the problem in order to make France a better country, were using the completely wrong statistics that were done by the anti-Semites, who said there were more than 1 million Jews, that etc., etc.
But at the same time, I mean, France was really the beacon of democracy until the war, because Leon Blum, he was elected, there was a law against anti-Semitism and so on. So let's see what happens after the defeat, and therefore we want to give again some context. So on 10th of May 1940, Germany attacks France, and after only 6 weeks, the fighting was over. And on 22nd of June 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany.
And France was in complete disarray. Millions had fled from the battles, and after the armistice, the northern parts of France, as well as the Atlantic coast, were occupied by the Germans. The southern parts and the French colonies stayed under French control and was what we call today the Free Zone.
There were 2 French zones, one occupied by the Germans and one, you called it Free Zone, Naya. So on 10th of July 1940, there was a National Assembly, and this voted with a great majority to give full legislative power to the war hero of the First World War, Marshal Pétain. The French Republic was rebranded in French state, État français in French, and the Republican motto of freedom, equality, brotherhood was replaced by work, family, fatherland. This is a very strong rupture with the Republican tradition of France. Were there any voices against this new French state? Because this was a vote by the parliament, if I'm correct.
It was a vote by the parliament, and with the exception of 80 deputies, all of them, all those who were present, voted for the suicide of the Republic. It is a suicide because the Germans didn't ask for anything of the kind. That's a decision, and that's very important to remember. And actually, no, it is, you're right, absolutely right. It's a complete rupture with all the values and with of the French Republic, of the French, as it has been considered until now, since the French Revolution. And yet, no, there was a silence of all the elites, the spiritual elites, I mean the churches, the intellectual elite, all of them actually were completely, and true, you said that the country was in disarray. The country was in disarray, but most of the people actually, I don't know if they sensed or believed or it seemed to be the result of everything which has been said against the Third Republic before the war. That it was corrupted, that it was in the hands of the Jews, that it was feeble, that it was not, it was just turning against France itself and not doing whatever should be done, etc., etc., etc. So the country was completely in disarray. And no, that you are right, and that's an excellent point. And the elites didn't react.
And so we talk about a big shift of values in France at that time. What role did anti-Semitism play in that new founded French state? Was it a core value?
Yes, it was absolutely central. Central for 2 reasons. Marshal Pétain was basing his policy on 2 feet. One of them was the National Revolution, which was a way of regenerating France in a new way. I mean, of course, I'm quoting him when using this term. By that, he meant to build a nation without the Jews, without the communists, without the Freemasons, without the foreigners. France, which would get back to its old values, the country, the hierarchy in the family, the central role played by the church, etc., etc., etc. So that was one of the feet on which his government was based. The second one was that his main purpose, and it was really more than a main purpose, it was an obsession by the Vichy government, was to regain sovereignty. In this policy of collaboration with Germany, France wanted to regain its sovereignty in as many fields as possible. One of them seemed a very easy, very topic to do that, which was the policy against the Jews. Actually, the idea was, we'll do it better than you do. We'll do it. Let us do it. And so we are facing from the beginning a double system of anti-Semitic laws, one initiated by the German occupiers, and the other one generated by the Vichy government. Now, in the second part...
sorry to interrupt you, but is this like the Vichy regime was copying the Nazi legislation, or did they introduce own measures? What did they do?
No, they have their own measures, and they were even sometimes fiercer than the German ones. There was a kind of competition between the Germans and the Germans. For instance, the first law statute on the Jews, the definition of the Jew in these statutes was more difficult, harsher than the one adopted by the German. And then the Germans adopted a new law which adopted what the French had said. So there was a kind of competition between the two. And
how was the definition of Jew in French law?
It's about the number of grandparents and parents and affiliation
so like
to
with
the Jewish
Nuremberg
religion,
laws.
etc. All the criteria. And the French were harsher in that case. And Pétain himself wrote down on the draft of the Jewish statute with his own hands, making it harsher for Jews. So it was very central. It was, as you said, really a core part of the anti-Semitic policy. Now, after July 42, we come in there is a new phase, which is not only legislation, segregation, pauperization. It's not only transforming the Jews into pariahs. It is about arresting them, deporting them, etc. Actually, what it meant was the implementation in France of the final solution, of the so-called final solution. And there, actually, in the beginning, the French were not so eager to do the dirty job, but they accepted because this way they could gain sovereignty against this obsession over the police. It was a settlement that allowed the French to be in charge of the police in both zones, that actually led the French government to accept to be the one to send its policemen to arrest the Jews. And all the dirty job was being done by the French for that reason. So sovereignty was a central part.
So did I understand that correct? So you're saying the French state under Marshal Pétain tried to save French sovereignty by doing the job of the Germans. So they said, the Germans want to arrest the Jews anyhow, so it's better we do it. So we have the French state doing it.
They were not actually at the beginning. They were not so eager to do it. But then, there was a kind of negotiation between the two, and in exchange for the French sovereignty over the police in both zones, they accepted to do that. So it's again. So that's what I'm saying. There are two bases to this French involvement. The first one is an ideological one based on all the ideas of the National Revolution. The second one is related to this thirst for sovereignty in every field.
So there's a rupture with Republican values. There are French policemen arresting Jews, bringing them to camps like Pithiviers and something like that, like Drancy. That was a camp that was guarded by a French policeman.
Yes, it was run.
What did the French?
Drancy until June of 1943 was run by the French, only by the French.
But what did the French public say to that? Was there any protest against that?
No.
No. So you say just no. There was no.
No.
Okay.
There was no. It was. I mean, it was. Actually, it's even worse than that. Until July of 1942, the elites and even the resistance remained silent. And when I'm saying that the resistance remained silent, I'm talking about the clandestine publications, the illegal press, which has been published by the different movements which began to emerge in France, and by the BBC from London. I mean, their main concern was to say, German propaganda is just nonsense. I mean, everything they write about Jews is completely nonsense. So that was one point, the German propaganda. The second thing was, we are not Jews. We are not Jews. I mean, the resistance was on the defensive. Most of the population supported Pétain. They wanted to gain its sympathy. All the reports they received, the letters received to London, what was going on in France was that actually the French people was quite happy with the anti-Semitic laws, with the idea that it was a way to give an answer to react to this famous Jew and presumed Jewish problem.
So, to say that for our listeners, in London, there was a French exile government under, was that already General de Gaulle? And,
yes.
And they had their own newsreels that were sent by the BBC and was together with the English produced. And maybe you can tell us something about your sources, because you said already you went through the publications of the Resistance, but also through the letters that were sent to the BBC and to London.
And a lot of letters were sent to the people there, and actually they didn't talk about the Jews, only to say that they were actually they were supporting Pétain and de Gaulle, and adding immediately, but we are actually very afraid that if the Allied win the war, the Jews will come back.
Okay.
So all these reports show that there were really a fear of these Jews dominating the world, and for that reason, the resistance. I mean, all the propaganda in France was telling all this propaganda by the so-called resistance is manipulated by the Jews. So their main concern was that we are not Jews. We are not Jews. We have somebody from Brittany, he has blue eyes, and this lady comes from another part of France, but no Jews between us.
Okay.
But however, we see that with Missak and Milene Manoukian, who entered the Panthéon not so long ago, there were foreigners also in the resistance, and Jews.
Yes. There were, I mean, first of all, I have to say that it was a very moving ceremony, and I mean, it was really something incredible which happened. And it's a new recognition of what happened during the war. And there were many Jews and many foreigners in the resistance. And Manouchian was an Armenian, but there were many Jews, and among those who have been executed and killed on February 21, 1944, half of them were Jews. So they were very numerous. But these are the communists, and this is a kind of specific question. And among the communists, there were groups of Jews, specific Jewish groups. And so it's it's really complicated. If you want me to get into that, I can.
No,
but
it was
it's
just
very
a question.
Complicated. Now, in the French movements, in the big resistance movement, there were many Jews as well, French Jews. But they felt that they were there as French citizens, and they couldn't go against the main current. When the main concern was to gain the support of public opinion, and public opinion was depicted as being anti-Semitic. I mean, they wanted to gain their support while focusing on what to them was defined as the most important thing, which is against occupation, a patriotic resistance. And actually, if you look at the movements inside France until the spring of 1942, most of them, not all of them, but most of them were struggling, fighting to against occupation, but supporting Pétain.
As we were at the house of the Wannsee-Konferenz, there is a quote from the protocol of the Wannsee-Konferenz, because they were talking about how would people in the different occupied and countries that were allied with Germany react on the persecution of the Jews, because they were now going a step further, not only persecution and stripping them from their civil rights, but also it was about what they called evacuation to the east, what was their wording for the systematic mass murder. And the protocol, I quote here, is, in occupied and unoccupied France, the registration of Jews for evacuation will, in all likelihood, be able to proceed without major difficulties. End of the quote. So here in Wannsee, they sat at the table and they said, well, in the Nordic countries, maybe there will some problems. They are not ready yet, but in France, we do not expect any problems. So that would underline what you said, that according to the Germans, there would be no problems from the French government and also not from the French public.
But however, you really point out the fact that in summer 1942, with the massive raids that are taking place against the Jewish population and the deportations that are starting, there's a real feeling of being horrified in France about what is happening to the Jews, and a real shock that the violence of all that. And how do you consider that as a turning? Is it a turning point in French public opinion?
Absolutely, it was a turning point, because suddenly there were, legislation was discrete. It's against people, and actually it was against people. You didn't face it on a daily basis. It was the Jews suffered from it, but the French people didn't face it directly. Here, they saw French policemen arresting families, children, pushing them into buses, into police cars. And then they heard about what was going on. And there was really, people were horrified. And it began with the Yellow Star in the northern zone in Paris, which they found, they find it not horrific. They couldn't stand that, most of them. So you see that here and because it's visible, visible. And more than that, that had nothing to do with the Jewish problem. How does this solve the Jewish question? It doesn't bring any solution to the Jewish question. It's pure barbarity. So that was really, people were horrified. And this was legitimated by some of the high hierarchy of the clergy, which protested against this treatment of human beings. Jews were human people. Women were human people. Yet, and that's very important to say, all this, the way all of this was expressed, and again, I'm coming back to the resistance movement, because they were very, very, and we'll come back to the sources afterwards, but very, very attentive to what happened in French, among the French people. It comes to a humanitarian humanitarian attitude. I mean, that's not human. We don't behave that way. The Germans forced us to, actually, they did it. And they are actually exercising this cruelty against children. That's pure barbarity. This is not us. They are sullying the soil of France. And the ultimate victim, I mean, that's from one of the broadcasts from London. The ultimate victim is France. Because France is being sullied by what is happening on its soil. And what the next step will be, all the French people. They are trying their strength on the Jews, but the next step will be doing the same thing to all the French people. So these were the main focuses in this protest as it was being expressed, which means that, and so some of them said it has nothing to do with the Jewish problem. I mean, they were very eager to distinguish between their human reaction and a political reaction. It was not a political reaction, it was a human reaction. This is impossible to bear. Such a thing is not, I mean, the French wouldn't do such a thing. And
you say they were not opposed to the anti-Semitic legislation, so if Jewish children would not turn up to public schools anymore, if they were not allowed to serve as advocates, as doctors, and so on, no problem there. If my neighbor has to move, or if the foreigner somewhere in the street is moved to an internment camp, that's something that they didn't lay awake at night of. But they were maybe a bit anti-Semitic, but they did not want to have atrocities. They did not want to have this violence.
And actually, something which is extremely important to stress is, from the beginning, the French people were extremely, they were supporting Pétain, but extremely anti-German, against the occupation. So, the enemy of your enemy becomes your friend. So this was done by the Germans. So if the Germans are doing that, we are against it. Okay. Suddenly the Jews become the one we have to protect. This is not possible to admit. I mean, they are doing that on our soil. Let's deal with our Jewish problem by ourselves. That's our problem. We have to deal it our way, in a French humanistic way.
Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting about your book, that it's not all black and white, but that it's more or less a huge gray zone, that you could be for the victory of the British, at the same time pro-Pétain, he is saving as much sovereignty for us as possible, a bit pro-de Gaulle, maybe listening to the BBC, and at the same time saying, well, it's good that the Jews have not as much power as they had before the war. So This was an attitude that is to be found very often in the letters that you cite in your book, and that I find very interesting, that it's not only black and white, but you had basically a lot of gray zone, and that people are not sure which side to pick, or that they even don't see the need to pick the side between de Gaulle and Pétain. It's not like that they are completely opposite to each other.
And that's the very reason why I prefer to use an analysis of what happened to this vision of a Jewish problem rather than to talk about anti-Semitism, because it allows us to see all those nuances.
So we are talking here about the shift between we have to defend the Jews. Is there also a shift in the public acceptance of the Vichy regime?
Yes, it was not the only reason, but there was. I mean, it showed how Vichy was dependent on the German and doing its dirty job, and the national pride was affected by that. I mean, how could we do this dirty job for the German? That's only Vichy could lead us to this kind of situation. So yes, there was a kind of shift, but that was one of the shifts. I mean, there was a shift a little bit earlier. This is one of the shifts. The main shift came after February of 43, when the French youngsters were drafted to compulsory labor service and sent to Germany to work. This was the real shift.
Because then the youngsters went underground in large numbers, and they were joining the resistance and so on.
Exactly, and they were helped by the population in the villages, because before that the resistance was especially vivid in the cities, and now actually all the peasants were protecting their own families, so it became much more widespread. And the more you get into the war, I mean, especially after Stalingrad, and it's the same time actually, it began to be obvious who is going to win the war. It was the Germans wouldn't win the war. Nobody knew when it's going to be finished and how many casualties there would be. But it was not the same situation as in 1940, when it seemed that it was absolutely impossible to defeat the German troops. So there it was obvious for everybody that any time in the future there would be a landing, and any time in the future an Allied landing, and any time in the future there would be a Allied victory. So people change according to that as well.
I want to ask you about the attitude of the peasant population, because if you look at the Western European context, in the Netherlands, I think there are 80% of the Jews are deported and most of them killed, although there was not that widespread anti-Semitism, as far as I can say, as it is in France in the beginning of the 1940s. In Belgium, it's still, I think, 40% of the Jewish population that is deported. In France, it's only, and only in quotation marks, of course, only 25%. So 75%, 3 out of 4 Jews in France survived the war, also due to the help of the population, especially in the countryside, who would not snitch, who would not report them to the police or to the Germans. So that's something that I find remarkable, and is of course very often remarked in French remembrance policy.
Yes, I was about to talk about that when we get to the question of remembrance, but it's not a true a true presentation of the situation. I'm sorry to say. I mean, of course, there were, but that's very convenient to see the things like that for the French people. And if you want, we can talk about that later. But if there was, there were Jews who lived until the end of the war, feeling afraid, feeling threatened, but they didn't even hide, and nothing happened. You had 30,000 Jews in Paris wearing the yellow star, and nobody arrested them. So, and nobody helped them to hide. And so it's much more complicated than that. And actually, I could say that if these are the numbers, it's thanks to the fact that the Germans didn't choose the right tactics to arrest all those Jews, but it's very complicated. It's really a question which needs. There is no, like you said, I don't see things in white and black. And here again, there are multiple causes. The main one being the policy adopted by the German. But the population might be one of them. But there were many people who snitched about the Jews. Many, and they didn't come back to tell about that. But you find all those letters in the archives. So it's not that easy. And of course, people who have been saved thanks to X or Y are telling those stories after the war. So it's really a complicated answer to that. But yes, it's very convenient for the French people to remember that this way. And it comes directly from Chirac, but we'll talk about that later if you want.
Okay. You write that the protest after an initial wave of indignation in the summer of 1942 subsided in the winter of 1942, although the persecution continued. What was the case? Was it that the attention shifted to the compulsory work for young men, or what was the reason that after the indignation, after the horror of the summer of 1942, there's not to found much protest after the winter of 1942?
One of the answer is what you just said. I mean, there were other preoccupations. People were afraid that the youngsters of the family would be sent to Germany, and they were eager to save them from that fate. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is that people were also expecting an Allied landing and very much afraid that France would become a zone of war again. So there was a kind of fear which didn't let much space for, but that would not be enough to explain the total silence. And I'm really talking about a total silence, except for the Jewish press, of any article on the fate of the Jews once they were deported, on the fact they were still being arrested every day, there were still mass arrests, etc., etc.
So is that true? You did write that General de Gaulle did not mention the persecution of the Jews in any of his speeches or allude to them. Is this that's right? Okay.
Yes,
I was really astonished by that.
Only that's really interesting. General de Gaulle only in an address at the beginning of the war, of the occupation, wrote to the World Jewish Congress to say that Jews would be reinstated in their rights, but he didn't remind at all the fate of the Jews. If I'm talking about the BBC broadcast, they were talking about the extermination process and even sending material from London to the different resistance movements. The resistance movement didn't pick up these texts and didn't mention anything about the extermination of the Jews or what happened to the Jews or the deportation, nothing. Only the Jewish Communist press did that. And as you said, there were other preoccupations, but that's not the main concern. I mean, I think that's not the only answer to that. Again, we come to face the Jewish problem. What appears in all the letters received to London, to all the reports, and I'm not saying that it's true about 95% of the reports, I'm saying that it's true about 100% of the report, is please don't confuse what the sympathy showed by the population to the persecuted Jews. They are horrified by the fate that happened to them when the Germans arrested the children and arrested them and deported them and teared apart families, but they are afraid that an Allied victory would bring the return of the Jews.
So they thought that talking about the fate of the Jews was a losing topic, that this would cost them public support in France. So don't bring it up, don't talk about it, because they are telling that we are the Judeo-Gaulists sitting in London, that we behind our backs is the Jewish conspiracy and so on. So we don't talk about the Jews at all. So they can't bring that up because this is a losing topic.
That's right. Henri Freinet himself, one of the leaders of one of the most important resistance movement, Combat, wrote specifically in August of 1943, it wouldn't be the General de Gaulle shouldn't be the one who brings back the Jews. I mean, in these words, in those very words. So, and it's really something which you can see in all, and all these reports were actually written by people of the resistance in France, and they were, I mean, expressing maybe their own feelings and maybe what they heard around them among the population. So I'm not saying that all the population thought that way. What I'm saying is that in London and among the resistance members, that was what they thought about the population, that the population was afraid that the Jews would gain again this kind of domination over France that they had before the war.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's switch to just after the war. So you talk about this silence of the Jewish question, and you say that we can find that in the memorial policies in France with a very public remembrance that is very centered around the French resistance, and then a more private one for the Jews. Can you explain a bit more what you meant by that?
Well, after a few weeks during which the extermination of the Jews was, I mean, there were many articles about that in the news. Afterwards, there was completely silence. And the Jews themselves, who were protesting against that silence, quickly understood that there was no way to introduce anything about what happened to them and to the public conscience. I mean, it wouldn't help. I mean, there wouldn't be. So they kept remembering between themselves. It was a kind of community remembrance. And that was true about the way two institutions were organized, one by the states, which collected documents and began to write the history of World War II, and the other one, which was a private one, which actually began to work during the war in clandestinity, and which settled in Paris after the war and began to collect. They did exactly the same work, parallelly the same work, but one was dealing with what happened to the French people, the other one what happened to the Jews, as if there were those were two different stories. So this way, when you have historians go to one archives and they work on the basis of what they find there, and all the archives related to the Jews were in another part. And so actually, and when you look also at the way people were reinstated in their rights, it was done very discreetly. It was not done publicly. It was done really very discreetly, as if, again, not to open the door to some big wave of popular anti-Semitism. So this is very, very interesting. So the Jews were not part of the public discourse at all.
That's so interesting because I talked with Naya, and I said that if I think about French historians of the Holocaust, I think, of course, about Serge Klarsfeld, about the two great directors, Ophüls, I think about Claude Lanzmann, and so forth, Leon Polyakov, of course,
all
of the earlier
Jews.
generation, and all of them Jews. And I only realized that when we looked that up. Because I knew from Klarsfeld, but Ophüls I didn't know, and all of them were Jewish historians. But they had such an impact on the history of the Holocaust, not only in France but also in Belgium, but also in Germany, because they came to Germany, and the wife of Serge Klarsfeld hit our chancellor. They came to the SS perpetrators, I think in Cologne, and smashed his windows time and time again. So it was a real active scene. So if you say privately, that maybe gives a wrong impression, because they were not only historians but also political activists in the best sense of the word.
That's true, but this began a little bit later. I'm talking about the very first years, And the fact that, for instance, even if you talk of historiography, Marshal Pétain and Klarsfeld actually wrote later, and as activists, they began their work before, but as historians, they began later. And if you look at what's happening, there was an historiography on what happened to the Jews during the war, which was not integrated at all into the historiography of what happened during the war in France. I mean, there were two parallel historiography which didn't meet. They didn't meet. And same goes with memory. Exactly the same parallelism can be seen, until actually the Shoah became an extremely central part of European conscience, public memory. But it was true of all Europe and even of the States. It suddenly burst into the memory and became very well installed in memory. And then there was no way to escape it. No way to escape it. But
maybe I ask a question to Naya, because you are the last one who visited a school in our group here. Did you learn about the Holocaust in the French school in your history lessons?
Yes, of course. Quite young, around 14 or 15. But what I realized is that we learned the same things until we're 17, and we learn about Vichy, for example, only in our last year of high school. So I think maybe we can talk about that, how maybe it changed today, if there's still these two separations between memory, because from what I feel, we're still very much in this resistance before everything.
I don't know if it's the resistance. I mean, it's probably came back to the forward now with the panthéonisation of Missak Manouchian, but the resistance itself, but it's the resistance of the foreigners. But what I would say that today, what's happening is what we were referring to before, is since 1995, and the fact that Chirac...
That was the speech of Chirac.
The speech of Chirac recognizing that France was to blame for what has been done to the Jews on French soil during the war. I mean, if you read all of this speech, you will find that the second part of the speech focuses on the French population, which has been remarkable, and thanks to it, 75% of the French population of the Jewish population of France has been saved. And as I told you, they were not deported, they were not arrested. To say that they've been saved is a bit far-fetched. Okay. But yes, so now there is a kind of reconciliation, but in a way, it's a way back to the immediate afterwar. Why? Because it again shows a kind of clear distinction between the state and the civil society, as if there was no support to the state by the civil society, as if there were two elements completely distinct one of the other. Jewish state is to blame for the deportation, and the Jewish population is to be thanked for the fact that it saved most of the Jews.
You mean the French state, the French population?
The French population, yes, is to be saved, to be lauded, because it has saved 75% of the Jewish population in France. So it's very interesting the way it's now, and that's become a common knowledge in France that yes, and you said that before.
I said that, yes.
The French people saved the Jews, which is not true. I mean, obviously, anti-Semitism was not as strong in France as it was in Poland. That's for sure. But no, the Germans part of the reasons is the way the Germans decided to implement in France the final solution. They just failed in two major actions, And when we come to the end of 1943, of course, I mean, they didn't have the means to arrest all the Jews which were remaining, and they had other problems. They knew that France might become and will become the place where the battle will take place very soon. And they didn't have manpower to arrest all the Jews. And true, the population has changed because they knew that the war was being won by the Allied. I mean, the same policemen who in November 42 were coming to French houses and arresting Jews, in November 43, when they were sent to arrest the Jews, they came and said, "We will come back in 2 hours."
Okay.
The very same people.
Okay, yeah.
So the situation, the conjecture has completely changed, and that's explained everything.
So thank you very much. I mean, that's a very important lesson in national myths and in the changing of people and in the characteristics of this occupation time that is very often very different from what we learn afterwards in our history lessons or with Remembrance Day. Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much, Naya, that you joined me in this podcast on France. We are very happy to have you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Renée, for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Renée.
And I want to thank both of you. It was indeed very interesting to talk with you.